Now, we've got a very special guest coming up in just a second. But on the whole world of wokeness, which we'll be talking about, great to see that the Woolies CEO stood down. You've seen the footage of that car crash of an interview that Rita referred to earlier. But what's interesting is if consumers stand up against wokeness, so this clown said that we wouldn't celebrate Australia Day at Woolworths. He's now gone after making a fool of himself on television. But more importantly, Woolworths seem to be waking up to the fact that if you spit in the face of consumers endlessly with your political virtue signalling, it's going to come back and hit your bottom line. They've now woken up to the fact that they've said, all those checkout people and staff stacking shelves and that who virtue signal with their badges, their LGBTIQ what's it badge, or their Aboriginal flag badge, or whatever it might be, whatever political virtue signalling, that now stops at Woolworths, according to this release, which is saying that staff may no longer display all this sort of rubbish, which is great news, and which shows that you, the consumer, do have the ability to change the insanity that is surrounding us now. Speaking of that insanity, let's go to our very special guest. So last week, if you remember, I showed you the story of Konstantin Kisin, how he first came on the show back in 2018, after he refused to sign a woke kind of thing that forbade him or gave a list of those things that he couldn't talk about in his comedy show. He's then gone on. I mentioned the amazing speech he gave at Oxford University, where he attacked both the cult of climate change and the cult of wokeness. He's got an amazing podcast, Trigonometry, which I'm sure many of you are listening to, and if you don't, you should. But the great news is Konstantin is about to get on an aeroplane and come to Australia. He's visiting here. Thanks to the CIS and the IPA, you can still get tickets there. But Konstantin Kisin here is with us this morning. Konstantin, great to have you back on Outsiders. Great to know you're coming out to Australia. Many, many people very excited about that. Now, tell us the craziness that is going on in the UK at the moment. There's so much you can talk to us about, but are we winning the war against woke, or is the West's freedoms disappearing?
It's hard to know. First of all, thank you very much for having me back on the show, and I cannot wait to come to Australia. It's actually my first time, and having met many Aussies over here, I'm actually very enthused, because I sometimes feel that you guys actually are holding on to the values of the West in a way that is perhaps not true in many other parts of it. So I'm excited to find out whether I'm right or wrong about that for a start. Maybe I'll turn up and it's not quite the case. We'll find out.
You'll see.
Yeah, I look forward to it. But it's, yes, we've had a lot of things here in the UK. And of course, one of the things that we all, I think, would recognize is wokeness is not only an ideology that is anti-Western at its core, that's about teaching our children false history that means that they don't even know why it is that we are as successful, as prosperous and comfortable as we are here in the West, and therefore not perhaps willing or able to defend those values or even articulate them nowadays. But the other thing we have seen here in the UK in recent days, I don't know if you guys have followed it, is that when you have this kind of policy and you have these kind of attitudes, it then means that we're not able to challenge and tackle very, very serious threats that we are now facing. So in the British Parliament on Wednesday, we effectively had the Speaker overturn decades, if not centuries, of precedent, simply because our police no longer willing to stand up to the threats that Islamists make against MPs, including left-wing MPs in Parliament, and we had all kinds of shenanigans going on as a result. So one of the things that is happening is we're essentially weakening our immune system, I feel, and our ability to resist internal and internal threats is challenged as a result. And so that's why I'm keen to come to Australia to speak at CIS events and others about what is the West, why are we as prosperous and comfortable and as free as we are, and how do we preserve that?
Rita.
Well, how do we preserve that when there seems to be so much self-loathing in the West, particularly from younger people who've had this indoctrination really from a very young age, from the culture, from the education system? How do we protect something that so many within the community see as toxic and oppressive and a feature of white supremacy?
Well, the first thing we've got to do is what we're doing here, which is start talking about the opposite to that. I agree with you, Rita, completely. We have probably 2 or 3 generations now, including my own, who not only have never been taught anything positive about the West, really. But they've also been taught that the West is evil, colonial, slavery, blah, 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 in a way that is completely decontextualized, one-sided, is not accurate. And one question that I'm always asking these young people is, like, we talk a lot about illegal immigration in all of our countries. Why is it that Australians aren't getting on small boats and trying to sail for safety or freedom or comfort or prosperity anywhere else? Let's talk about that. Let's actually find out why we are where we are. And I think that's the beginning of the conversation. I think the biggest thing that has happened, not only in my lifetime, but also prior to my lifetime, really, is the destruction of our history. And Orwell warned us about this: who controls the past controls the future. So the first thing we have got to do is start teaching our children. And that, frankly, look, the education system is always going to be captured to some extent by people who at this point hate our societies. We have got to start by teaching our own children the values of the West and the history of the West in a proper way. If we can do that, perhaps we can recapture elements of the education system. And I really do think it starts from there, because unless we are able to articulate how we got here, I just don't see the West enduring in the long term.
James.
Well, Konstantin, I'm glad you mentioned Orwell, because I was just thinking about, as you were speaking about, this Orwellian trope on the part of the elites, not just the young people, but the elites seem to be very much in favor of undermining and hollowing out all the things that they say they're in favor of. And one of the things we hear all the time is the phrase "our democracy," which is code word for, everybody has to vote the same way, otherwise there's some sort of threat. We see this with Trump, we see this with other candidates. Are the elites, or the leadership class, are they actually leading us to some sort of crisis? I know you talk about, recapturing parts of the education system, and maybe we can turn things around down the road, but it seems to me that the people in charge do not believe fundamentally in the democracy and in the liberal societies that they claim to, with their rhetoric, be defending.
I completely agree with you. And one of the most dangerous things that I have observed in the last 8 years or thereabouts is the fact that whenever the people actually express their opposition to something that is being done, instead of hearing that outcry, which we saw with Brexit, which I didn't vote for, by the way, or which we saw in America with Donald Trump and others around the world, the rising wave of populism isn't coming out of nowhere. This is something I keep trying to tell people, especially my friends on the left. You've got to pay attention when the people speak and when they rise up and say, we don't want this. We don't want to be going down this path. We don't want to be moving in this direction. And I agree with you completely. If the elites do not start listening to the people, they are the ones that are going to destroy our democracy, because on all sorts of issues, whether they're economics or domestic issues, or whether it's foreign policy, or whether it's cultural issues that I actually think are really, really important. People like us always get accused of, being culture warriors, which to me betrays this very funny thing that as if culture doesn't matter. Culture is the thing that matters most in a society. It is the difference between a successful society and a failed society. We know this. So the people who are destroying our culture will dismiss us as culture warriors. We're actually, what we should be saying is, culture really matters, and we should be talking about it and winning the argument on that as much as we can. But I agree with you. Listen, if the people in charge do not start listening to the public on all sorts of issues, I mean, I know that in Australia, for example, the issue that is so crucial to young people here in the UK is just as difficult as the housing crisis. And if you don't fix that, I keep saying to people, including my friends on the conservative side of things, if you don't fix this, and they're in charge, they've been in charge here in the UK for 14 years now, why would young people support democracy? If I can't vote my way out of the things that are not working in my life, why would I support the system? And I think one of the reasons, frankly, that there are sections of both left and right that are increasingly enamored with tyrannical and authoritarian foreign regimes like Putin's Russia is because they're losing faith in democracy. We're in a very dangerous place, and people in charge have to listen to the public.